Hello! I've been wondering, what does it take in today's world to dominate the global system? From my perspective, what I believe is currently unfolding is that President Donald Trump is actively pursuing a strategic foreign policy, whose ultimate goal is to significantly undermine and weaken the Iranian regime, while at the same time consolidating a much greater level of global control and influence. And of course, we also have to talk about the price of oil, because as you may know, there has been a very sharp increase. So the question is this price increase really due to a lack of physical oil in the markets, or are there other factors at play? But for now, let's answer the first question. What does it take today to dominate the world? From my point of view, the key element would be artificial intelligence. But artificial intelligence has a problem, and that is that it consumes enormous amounts of energy. Therefore, the country that aspires to lead the world not only needs to master artificial intelligence, but also to have abundant and cheap energy. However, there is a third element that is also very important. It's not enough to have cheap energy. It's necessary for competitors to have more expensive energy. In other words, power is not just about having resources, but also about controlling others' access to those resources. If we look at the case of the United States, we see that it is the world's largest oil producer. In addition to being one of the largest producers of natural gas, and it even dominates the production of a very important element, which is helium, for the manufacture of chips. In other words, it has a very solid energy base. But to maintain a strategic advantage, it also needs to influence the routes through which energy circulates in international trade. If we analyze it closely, we will see that the United States has a presence and influence in several key points of world trade. And I'm going to give you a few examples. The Panama Canal, the Red Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, and also the Northwest Passage near Greenland. All of these points are bottlenecks for global energy trade. Now, there is only one critical point left that is not under its direct control. And this is the Strait of Malacca, through which a large part of the energy trade destined for China passes. At that point, that major strategic location is still under the influence of Asia. In the specific case of the Strait of Hormuz, we are seeing that the United States has announced that it could provide cheaper insurance for ships passing through that area. And in addition, the US Navy could escort the oil tankers. In other words, in practice, this means something very simple. The United States would come to control the flow of energy through that strait. And who especially depends on that energy? It is mainly the Asian countries, especially China and Japan, that depend on it. Therefore, the strategy could be seen as an attempt to control the choke points of global energy flow. From that point of view, China could end up being the big loser. Even if it controls the Strait of Malacca, if it wants to secure its energy supply, it will have to rely heavily on Russian gas from Siberia or increase its imports from Russia. And we know that although both countries cooperate in certain areas, their historical relationship is actually quite complex. The energy management of the Iranian regime leaves much to be desired. It's surprising that despite having so much oil revenue, they haven't invested more, thank you, in energy infrastructure or in expanding its storage capacity, building alternative pipelines, or developing a larger fleet of its own oil tankers. Even part of Iran's oil revenues go through the Western financial system, which is a significant vulnerability. But there is an even more striking aspect. We are seeing significant bombings inside Iran. However, there is a key facility that is not being attacked. If we look at this chart, we will see Karg Island, located in the southwest of Iran. Approximately 90% of Iranian oil is exported through this island. In other words, whoever controls this island controls the main source of income for the Iranian regime. And yet, this facility is not being bombed. In fact, Chinese oil tankers have even been seen loading oil in that area. The island has relatively limited defenses, which suggests that instead of destroying it, they might try to blockade it. In fact, there are reports indicating that the Pentagon is considering that possibility. The logic would be simple, not to destroy the infrastructure, but to control it so it can be used later on. Furthermore, the support that the United States is providing to the Kurds in northern Iran could have another objective: to force Iran to move troops northward, leaving the southwest, where Karg Island is located, more vulnerable. Now, let's turn to the oil market. The question is as follows: is the rise in oil prices really due to a physical shortage of oil? For me, the answer is no. Most of the oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz is headed to Asia, that is China and Japan. But these countries were aware of the geopolitical risk, so they have been aggressively buying oil for many months now to increase their reserves. Therefore, these countries have the capacity to withstand a temporary closure of the strait for some time. It is estimated that they would need approximately 2 months to return to the previous situation in the event of a supply interruption. This means that there is no immediate shortage of oil in the global market. In addition, the United States could increase its production if necessary. Even the G7 has been considering the possibility of releasing part of its strategic reserves. So, in reality, what kind of announcements tend to have more of a psychological effect than a real one? If we look at this chart, we'll see that the price of oil reached about $119 this morning, but then fell back toward the $105 area. In my opinion, the recent rise in oil prices is not so much due to a physical supply problem, but rather to dynamics inherent to the financial markets. Many investors held short positions in oil, and there were also numerous options sold around the $100 level. When the price surpassed that level, many stop orders and short position closures were triggered, which caused a very rapid rise. Now the question is whether new money will enter the market or if the movement will run out of steam. This rise in oil prices caused declines in several Asian stock markets, and we also saw pressure on S&P 500 futures. There's also an interesting detail. Bitcoin is rising by around 2% while gold is falling. So this behavior is not what we would typically expect if the markets were anticipating a long and very serious conflict. Well, I'll leave you with this reflection so you can analyze it calmly. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'll see you in the next video.